You're listening to Inside Eyes, and I'm your host, Laura Mae Northrup. Welcome back, people. Thank you for joining me. I'm your host, Laura Mae Northrup. We are on episode 4 of season 2. If you are starting this series for the first time, please note that the series is roughly designed to be listened to as a sequential series, as well as individual episodes. There might be important topics covered in one episode and then expanded on in another. Basically, a lot can be gathered by listening to the entire series in order. I encourage you to go back to the first episode in this season, entitled Welcome Magic, and start there. And before I go on, I want to share that I wrote and published a book. My book is called Radical Healership: How to Build a Values-Driven Healing Practice in a Profit-Driven World. This is a book that is essentially about what it means to be some type of healing practitioner surviving within capitalism and all the complexities that come with that. It has a lot of practical information about how to run your practice, but what sets it apart from similarly oriented books is the politicized frame and the encouragement to think very deeply about what it is that you're actually doing with your path in the context of our times. You can find it anywhere books are sold, including ordering it through an independent bookseller. It is part memoir and part politicized self-help, and if you get the audiobook, it's read by yours truly. It is already sold out of its first printing, and people seem to find it super helpful. So, if you like what you hear on my show, the same level of heart and intention is waiting for you in that book. If you're considering becoming a healing practitioner, or you already are one, but you want to rethink how you walk your path, check it out. Again, it's called Radical Healership: How to Build a Values-Driven Healing Practice in a Profit-Driven World. And please note, although at the time of this recording, I am a licensed psychotherapist in the state of California in the United States, this podcast is not therapy, it is not a substitute for therapy, and it is not advice attuned to your specific needs. So please seek advice from a trained, competent practitioner about your specific situation to keep you as safe as possible before embarking on any healing with psychedelics or entheogens. I offer these insights in the spirit of harm reduction and education. And remember, there is sensitive content in these episodes that is not suitable for children. Okay, on to today's show. Last episode, I talked about feelings and the mechanics of how processing and resolving feelings actually works. And today, I'm going to build on this and talk about suffering and what it is to suffer with meaning. As a psychotherapist, I spend most of my workdays helping people suffer. And I know that might seem strange. You might think I'm trying to help people to suffer less, which in a way I am. But suffering is a normal part of life, and we can do it in ways that are more or less effective at resolving our emotional pain. It may be helpful to clarify that pain is the unavoidable aspect of how you experience what happens to you, and suffering is how you respond to it. For example, if I stub my toe and it hurts, that is pain. When I pause and take a moment to check out my injury and exclaim, "Ow," I am suffering. I might take the time to reflect that I was rushing and those were the conditions that led to the pain. Perhaps I think about how I could practice slowing down. That might be part of what comes from my suffering. However, if I then tell myself how I am clumsy and stupid and I always hurt myself, I am engaging in increasing my suffering by causing myself more pain with negative self-talk. Some suffering leads to the cessation of suffering, and some leads to more suffering. Where I live in the US, there is a lot of fantasy about avoiding suffering adrift in the dominant culture. We often think, or are told, that it is possible to avoid suffering with things like money, status, and privilege. The narrative goes, if you are rich enough, you can pay to get rid of your suffering. You can buy products and services that shield you from your fragility. Hyper-capitalist American culture seeks to obscure vulnerability, forgetting that ultimately we are all living beings, one unfortunate circumstance from death and suffering at all times. This is the fantasy that anyone with enough power can control life to the point that suffering is escapable. And sometimes that frame of mind may actually lead us to feel entitled to a life without suffering. While it is true that privilege allows an immense amount of control over one's life, and that often means avoiding suffering, there are some types of suffering we cannot avoid. And averting suffering through privilege often requires shifting the suffering to someone else via exploitation or other abuses of power. I would be remiss not to mention the level of suffering that comes from having too much control over one's life. Spontaneity and surrender are important experiences in the road to peace and happiness. And even in a utopian society, without war or violence or systems of oppression, there will always be breakups, deaths, illness, accidents, and other forms of loss. Another commonly held fantasy is that being good or working hard will equate to no suffering. Hence the adage, good things come to good people. The idea being that you can master suffering through your behavior. While being kind often elicits kindness from others, adhering to whatever behaviors one considers moral or good still won't result in the ability to control suffering. And while working hard can be a powerful way to shape one's life, it also doesn't equate to controlling the level of suffering we experience. As humans, we simply cannot escape suffering. And when we put an excessive amount of focus on not suffering, we often neglect learning how to suffer. But being able to suffer is very critical to healing, and especially for healing sexual trauma and using an expanded state to access that healing. Being able to suffer is also deeply tied up in our collective liberation. We need the strength to suffer so that we are not imprisoned by our trauma, reducing us to lives of coping instead of lives of stewardship, protecting each other, advocating for each other, speaking the truth, and caring about one another. Trauma is something that occurs when we are made to suffer beyond what we can tolerate. And as humans, we have many strategies to cope with overwhelming experiences. And while those ways of coping may get a job done, they aren't necessarily easeful. For most of us, the way we cope with trauma actually creates additional suffering. However, it is usually a more tolerable suffering than whatever we are trying to avoid. For example, let's take that short fictional case I presented last episode with the character Melissa. In the last episode, I described Melissa as having trust issues and struggling to be close to people. Not being close to people makes us lonely. So we can construe from this story that Melissa is probably fairly lonely. And even though it might not be framed this way by Melissa, one way of thinking about this problem is that Melissa finds loneliness more tolerable than the grief, anger, sadness, and fear she would have to confront if she went into the actual trauma she had experienced. And so she suffers daily through not feeling as connected to other people as she would like. Circling back to the healing method of using psychedelics and entheogens, we have such a strong cultural emphasis on defending against suffering by way of entertainment and luxury. And it's easy to view expanded states through that lens, focusing on the visuals, focusing on blissful experiences, deeming harsh or painful journeys as, quote, bad trips, spending thousands of dollars to attend, quote, boutique therapy, and yes, that is a term people use, and do your journeying in a, quote, spa-like atmosphere, advertised as an experience for, quote, elite professionals. These are just some of the ways that suffering is treated as a bad thing, as opposed to a necessary part of the process. And some of this espouses a narrative that you are elite and special, as opposed to human and able to relate to most other people if you really get down to what matters in life. So I want to emphasize this. Suffering is a necessity in healing. Another common form of avoiding suffering in the world of expanded state healing is called spiritual bypassing. Spiritual bypassing is basically what happens when people use spirituality to defend against their painful emotions. Sometimes this manifests as a person using psychedelics or entheogens and then viewing themselves as not having any additional healing to do simply because of the number of times they have entered an expanded state, rather than assessing their healing based on their actual life, or viewing themselves as incapable of causing another person harm because they have achieved, quote, enlightenment. We are always capable of causing harm, even when we have done a lot of personal work. And there is always more healing to do as we accrue new wounds throughout our lives. It is good to keep an eye out for spiritual bypassing and general rejection of suffering, because the wellness industry is quite complicit with this, and many practitioners promote these ideas, which I personally don't think is very helpful. But you know what? It isn't that wild of a desire to be in less pain or to control your pain by being the master of it. It is very understandable. How many times have I listened to a fellow human or myself lament, "It just seems like bad things keep happening. When will it stop?" The reality is that bad things do keep happening in big and little ways. And even in the best of circumstances, We have many needs to be comfortable. Things need to stay the same, but not too same. That would be boring. Things need to be interesting, but not too interesting. That would be overstimulating. No one should age or die, but aging and death are the only certain guarantees in one's life. Despite what the wellness industry may be suggesting, health and wellness is not a lack of suffering. It is not choosing what you suffer and what you don't. It is the ability to suffer with effectiveness and meaning. When someone you love dies, it is normal to lose one's mind for a moment or many moments, to wail, to cry, to pound the earth, to stop eating, to devote every moment to thinking of them. It is normal to feel nothing joyful. This is all because grief is normal. When we make mistakes or cause harm, it is normal to feel ashamed. Health and wellness culture fetishizes happiness and tells us not to be ashamed. Well, if you hurt someone, it is normal to be ashamed of that. When we are so overwhelmed by grief or shame or other painful emotions because we don't have the internal and external resources to cope with the feelings, and then we push them away, but they keep coming back in confusing and unconscious ways, that is when we start to suffer beyond reason, beyond what is intrinsic to being alive. If you don't let yourself grieve, you will suffer much more than if you do. If you don't honor your shame, you will suffer an eternity of it knocking at your door. Emotions aren't always comfortable. They're physically intense, mentally intense, and spiritually intense. They remind us of our mortality and our fragility. Being present in your emotions is something that connects you to your humanity and to the sacredness in all other living creatures. Remembering our mortality is essential to living a spiritually grounded life and respecting the mortality of all other life. This too is an important part of our collective liberation. It reminds us that we are connected, that, as U.S. peace activist Rachel Corrie once said, quote, "We dream their dreams and they dream ours," end quote. It pains me to admit that as individuals, we are powerless to make lasting political change. It is only in our collective relating that we will see the power to liberate ourselves and this earth from the wretched talons of capitalism and systemic oppression. It is only in our collective empowerment that we can prevent sexual violence. As I said in the last episode, once we metabolize our feelings, just as with food, we are then able to gain nutrients from them, which in the case of feelings is wisdom. For example, sadness metabolized can become empathy. Shame metabolized can become compassion. Fear can become discernment. Anger can become action and protection. Powerlessness can become acceptance. The wisdom produced through meaningful suffering is helpful when it first arises, but it also helps us to suffer more effectively in the future. Finding that shame can become compassion is very relieving the first time we experience that shift. But wisdom is an embodied experience that stays with us. Each time we cultivate more of it, we become more wise, and in this example, more able to bring compassion to future experiences of shame. Psychedelics and entheogens can be very fun, and many people associate them with partying and therefore think they are an easy way to heal. However, in a healing context, the story is more likely that they help us suffer with profundity. They force us to cry, to wail, to face what we avoid. And this is especially true if you have survived severe trauma. I say this not to imply that you will not also experience joyful emotions in expanded state healing, because those feelings happen too, but rather to emphasize that uncomfortable emotions can be a significant part of the healing. For this reason, working on your relationship to suffering and uncomfortable feelings before you enter a healing-focused expanded state will support you. Being in a medicine journey where you have less control over what happens can be very uncomfortable. And I really want to highlight that for sexual trauma survivors, because sexual trauma is an experience of having little control over what happens to you. And while in a medicine session, you may be guided into a level of suffering that is technically healing, it can also be quite overwhelming. This is a reason that therapy, meditation, journaling, and other slow processes can be great ways to prepare for an expanded state. In therapy, when you get overwhelmed, you can just stop and tend to the overwhelm. With some types of expanded state inducing medicine, you may have that option to slow it down, to pause, but with many medicines, you are on the ride and there is no eject button. In a sense, part of preparation for a medicine journey is building up your pain tolerance, your shame tolerance, your fear tolerance, and your general ability to tolerate whatever emotions you find uncomfortable. Some people listening may not relate to avoiding suffering, and actually relate to seeking out suffering, perhaps even engaging in self-punishment. This can look like not feeling allowed to be at peace, not feeling allowed to take it easy, feeling experiences must be challenging to be worthwhile or produce healing, or depriving oneself of certain needs and comforts. If you're a person who spends a lot of time orienting towards suffering, suffering within the journey space may be less challenging for you. However, your task may also be to suffer less or to suffer differently, which can produce its own challenges. It may be the case that you are doing work to build up your tolerance for joy, peace, or love. Many trauma survivors find peacefulness and calm to be extremely uncomfortable and seek out stressful stimulus to avoid calm experiences. While avoiding suffering and suffering as self-punishment might look like two very different experiences, ultimately, they both obscure the suffering that needs to happen for healing to occur. If you are approaching a journey with a high level of concern about whatever type of experience you tend to avoid, be it pain or bliss, you can tell your guide, who can support you to think through dosage in regard to the level of tolerance you have for being overwhelmed. Or if you're doing a DIY solo journey or having a friend trip sit, you can think critically about what kind of dose is appropriate given your level of fear or experience with the particular substance. There will be more on solo journeys and trip sitting in episode 13. An important thing to know about healing trauma is that it generally requires that you are in an activated state, because the trauma has to be somewhat alive in you in order to process it. The trick is having it be alive, but not being in a full-blown triggered or flooded state. And the way that we do this is through building capacity to tolerate intense emotions. That way, you can feel a lot, but also be present in that feeling. For any somatic psychotherapists listening, this is called working at the edge of the window of tolerance. Emotions always have a physical component. In fact, some would say the somatic aspect of an emotion is the primary experience of it. And what that means is that you experience actual physical pain. So feeling disgust feels disgusting. It feels terrible. It feels like nausea and a churning stomach and an impulse to vomit. Feeling ashamed actually feels pretty terrible as a somatic state. As I spoke about in the feelings episode, we have to express our feelings for them to resolve. But first we have to feel them. And this is where a lot of the suffering exists, in the actual embodied experience. Many people become afraid that the embodied suffering of an emotion won't end. People start to suffer and think, holy shit, this is so bad, shut it down. But that suffering is the Band-Aid getting ripped off. It isn't eternity. It is the pinprick before the medicine is delivered. And this is important to remember both in and outside of an expanded state. Suffering is one step in the process toward resolving an emotion. It is unfortunately a step we often get caught on and by our own devices elongate. And with severe trauma, it can feel like the emotions will last an eternity. However, while you are an emotional being and will be until your physical form ends, you will not always feel intense shame or intense rage. You will hopefully only feel those emotions in moments and then have a reprieve. Each of us is different in what we need and what healing will look like. Some people will suffer their true feelings and resolve them quickly. For others, it will take much longer. But the key here is that if you go into the feelings with courage and surrender to them, much like a wave, they will build, peak, and crash. And there will be moments when you have some mercy, some quiet, and peace. And if they need to be felt some more, another wave will come. So much of healing from trauma is building the skills to embrace the wave, let it run its course, feel what is real in that moment, and allow it to subside. The final thing I want to talk about is the role of curiosity in navigating suffering. We don't have to love suffering. We just have to allow it. I'm going to tell a personal story about the value of curiosity as a tool to deal with suffering. One time, I was in an expanded state. Shocker, I know. Prior to going into that expanded state, I had a very bad experience where I realized someone was lying to me about something very important. And prior to learning about the lie, I had an intuitive hit that something was wrong. And I had some not great feelings about the situation that I ignored. So, fast forward to the point at which I was in an expanded state. I felt this horrid pain. It was just the worst physical sensation, right in my gut. And I resisted it. I tried to ignore it. I complained. I said to myself, this is wrong. I shouldn't be feeling this. I was generally resisting the experience. And I was definitely doing some very meaningless suffering. This was going on for a long time. And the resistance is what made it meaningless. No resolution came from doing that. So at some point, out of exhaustion, I paused and I said to myself, what is even happening right now? And I noticed it's a dull pain. It's in my abdomen. It's sort of a dense mass with a core. And it feels sort of like anxiety plus something I could only describe as extreme discomfort. So I'm sitting there and feeling it and thinking, I don't like this, which isn't pushing it away. It's still being present to it. But I was letting myself know while I was focusing on the pain. I also did not enjoy the pain. Then I'm sitting there and I think, okay, I'll try moving around and see if that reduces the pain. Is that making the pain any better? No. Okay, maybe I'll try breathing differently. No, that doesn't seem to be working. Maybe I'll try shaking, then moaning. And what happens if I complain a bit? I'm going to say out loud, I hate the way this feels. Okay, what happens if I sing a little song? Okay, none of this is working. What happens if I damn this medicine I consumed and say I will never do it again? A little pause. Okay, no, that's not working either. And I'm going on and on like that with not a lot of success. And at some point, I stopped trying to make it go away and I refocused my curiosity. I said to the pain, what do you have to teach me? And then I got the message. Some people might say it was a message that came from me, that I made it up, that it came from my ancestors, that it came from the medicine I consumed. But whatever and wherever it came from, what I heard is this. This is the feeling of you having a limit with someone else. You feeling done with the conversation, feeling hurt by something someone said, having an intuition that there is something you don't like about the interaction, and you don't listen to that. And when you don't listen to it, bad stuff happens. And this is that gut feeling with the volume turned up 1000%. Because when you feel it in your daily life, it's really small. It's just like an, ooh, God, little gut feeling. But you are feeling it right now in a way that you will never forget. And that is so when this feeling comes up, you can say to yourself, you know where this goes. It goes to extreme pain. So it's time to make a boundary. It's time to set the limit. At that point, the suffering made so much sense. It was no longer a confusing thing I needed to push away, but rather an incredible tool I needed to embrace with as much curiosity as I could muster. And the moral of this tale is that it was surrendering to the suffering and being curious about it, looking it head on and engaging with it that brought the wisdom, that allowed the healing to come forward. Curiosity is a powerful tool in supporting your healing to go deeper. And as I am describing it, curiosity is a practice, a level of engagement, and an action. It is something we can get better at. It is something that you can practice in a sober state, prior to an expanded state or after one. Even in the next hour of your day, you can ask yourself, is there any way to suffer this moment with more meaning? To be curious about what is happening? To be with or allow what is, despite the pain it could bring? Your post-journey integration work will be the slow observing of moments like this in the mundane, far from glamorous parts of your day. Little things, like the way many of us procrastinate to avoid potential shame, then rush at the end and get stressed out. Or big things, like avoiding telling someone in your life that you need their help rather than suffering through the vulnerability of asking, and instead suffering the deprivation of needing and not having. The poet, philosopher, and artist Khalil Gibran wrote this about pain, and I would say about suffering as well. Your pain is the breaking of the shell that encloses your understanding, even as the stone of the fruit must break, that its heart may stand in the sun. So you must know pain. And could you keep your heart in wonder at the daily miracles of your life? Your pain would not seem less wondrous than your joy. And you would accept the seasons of your heart, even as you have always accepted the seasons that pass over your fields. And you would watch with serenity through the winters of your grief. Much of your pain is self-chosen. It is the bitter potion by which the physician within you heals your sick self. Therefore, trust the physician and drink his remedy in silence and tranquility. For his hand, though heavy and hard, is guided by the tender hand of the unseen. And the cup he brings, though it burn your lips, has been fashioned of the clay which the potter has moistened with his own sacred tears. That is from his book, The Prophet. All right, we will leave it there for today. I wish you all a curiosity-filled day. Thanks for listening, and if you want to support the show, please take a moment to rate it on whatever podcasting app you use, and please share this episode with people who may benefit. Thank you so much for supporting this work. I teach occasional classes, offer group and individual consultation to clinicians around the world, and provide psychotherapy to people located in California. If you are curious about my offerings, you can find more information and contact me via my website, lauramainorthrup.com. And here is where I give out my social media handles. But I want to say a little something about social media. You only see what ends up being popular enough to come into your feed the days that you look at the app, an app that is controlled and censored by capitalist elites. If you want to ensure you hear about ways to work with me, learn from me, or get healing support, join my email list. I send very few emails, like 5 a year. You can find it on my website, lauramainorthrup.com, or there's a link in the show notes. And if you want to see memes and leave things up to social media fate, find me on Instagram at lauramainorthrup. And don't forget, I have a new book out, Radical Healership. Check it out, link in the show notes. Okay, until next time.